Hello.
Our story begins with a galaxy-defining job, one that put Cad Bane into the lineup to be one of the highest-paid bounty hunters in galactic history. The job was simple. He had outperformed Jango Fett in one mission, one that led to this current job. Cad was to become the genome donator for the clone army, a very simple request that required the gift of his blood. Aside from simply donating these genes, he had successfully earned this position by performing more adequately during a combative strike against some politicians. It was one of two missions at the same time. Jango Fett and Cad Bane weren't working together, but their mission statements were the same thing. One was to kill a number of politicians working for an opposition party. Their guard unit was 40 strong, and everyone needed to die. Jango was able to deal with this, but faced some initial struggles. Bane, on the other hand, had to fend off a rival conglomerate rising to challenge the Trade Federation. This would include about 56 henchmen, plus a leader who was more talented with a blaster than most bounty hunters. Not to say that Cad accomplished this mission with ease, but his production was more efficient than Jango's, who had a lesser challenge. This was in a line of several other missions that both completed. These were slim margins to win by, but it was enough to push Bane to the forefront of the plan to destroy the Jedi. Unlike his fellow bounty hunter, Cad had little interest in these dealings aside from getting paid. He understood what the clone army meant, to a degree, but Cad also couldn't be all that upset about this agreement. The contract signed with Tyrannus included continuous visits to Kamino to ensure the efficiency of the genome use. On top of this, Cad had to sign over at least 10 years of sporadic service to the separatist movement. Because this didn't impede his work with the syndicates and mob bosses, he literally couldn't care less. This was just an assurance that he would service the CIS when they requested it of him, and he obliged without even looking through the fine print. This didn't hurt him at all, it simply made him richer. Cad Bane could check in on Kamino a couple times a year, per the contract requests, but he didn't do anything. He would lazily wander around until the check cashed, and then bounce to do something more interesting. Cad was able to outfit himself with new pistols, a starship, a collection of hats, and whatever else he needed. This was the great payday for him, and he had very little interest in the cloning project. The best part is, it wasn't in the job description to handle any complications that the Kaminoans might come across. This was probably the best thing to happen to him because they had a number of complications that he didn't have to worry about. Every time he returned to the cloning facilities, their problems had multiplied, and they were forced to question Cad to get answers on why certain things were going awry. Working with a Duro was a little bit different than working with a human. Jango Fett would have been a lot easier to account for, but because Cad Bane was both a maniac and a Duro, they had a multitude of issues arise that they couldn't necessarily prepare for. Initially, the first concern came from the explosion of brain cells. Kaminoan scientists were the best in the business, but there were problems with expanding Cad Bane's genetic base to thousands of clone assets, so they had to clone the genome itself to create those other clones. That in turn led to infants literally exploding. They would come out of the incubator and boom, first touch of air and sent them spiraling. This wasn't the case with all of them, but say 70%. Due to the time crunch and the need for able-bodied troops in 10 years, they were almost panicking, but not yet. They still had time to work with. The Kaminoans also had many problems because of the Duro's brain. The species originated from an ancient reptile on Duro itself. Their expansion out into the galaxy came from an affinity for space travel, thus leading surviving clones in the early experiments to be more inclined to carry rebellious traits. This was expected because they were working with a bounty hunter, but even neutralizing some biological tendencies to rebel didn't stop the surviving clones from being a hassle to deal with. The Kaminoans also had an issue with the inhibitor chips. The biology of the Duros didn't really assist them in the usage of the inhibitor chip. While they were able to create semi-similar incubators to the eggs used to hatch the species, the Kaminoans didn't necessarily have the answer to successfully implant the chips, though they had some alternative ideas that they will use with some test batches, which would have a decade worth of biological growth in about 4 months. It was a hyper-intense study on the physical body, but it would provide evidence for success rates with the inhibitor chips. There were realistically 2 alternatives. use the chips and plant commands as necessary to adjust for Tyrannus' specifications, or use memory as the key. See, the Darrow had a biological tendency to hold photographic memories. They were incredible storytellers for a reason. The thought, or hope, was that if the chips didn't function as necessary, that they could utilize the photogenic memories to implement the executive contingency orders. But this was all pure speculation. A lot of the questions the Kaminoans had for Cad Bane were about his memory abilities, cultural influences, and positions held by his friends back home. What friends? Bane didn't really know, but he readily communicated whatever they asked to him, though some of these were half-truths, so that his check would bounce. Cad didn't want to be in the facilities on Kamino at all. He hated the rain, and he really didn't care for the scientific-brained creatures. So he did what he had to do to squeeze answers out of himself and escape their cloning stations with his new checks. This would of course lead to some other fundamental issues with the clones, but thanks in part to Cad's semi-truthful answers, the clone army would quickly be scrounged together for a temporary showing before Tyrannus and his master on a hologram. The Sith plan was coming together, and the young Darrow cadets were showing off their effectiveness as a combat unit. While Cad could take an interest in them, especially as they got older and became more functional creatures, he didn't. He really loathed them, and he honestly would have no issue killing them if he had to. That was the kind of sick thing about Cad. He had no issue with destroying his own creations, because in his mind, they could never be him. They were genetically modified beasts to fit a role, and that was it. In his mind, they were sentient droids, nothing more and nothing less. As the cloning process continued, though, the Kaminoans came up with their choice for maintaining the contingency orders without failure, or at least widespread failure. There were some issues with fully activating the order. They weren't really discussed with Tyrannus because it was a controlled issue, but that was an unforeseen problem that wouldn't hit the clone army until the Galactic War erupted in the years following these found problems. To say the Kaminoans avoided these mishaps would be incorrect. They simply painted over them, with hopes that it would fulfill any needs that Tyrannus might request. It worked in their favor. They had no real problems come from these minor cover-ups, but they also didn't anticipate how they might grow into new forms. See, the Clone War, when it started, increased chances for the clones to have traumatic experiences. The cover-up plans utilized by the Kaminoans were more like brain deactivation, without fully killing the experiments themselves. Essentially, some of the clones struggle with their response to some of the contingency orders. Therefore, the Kaminoans had to neutralize certain portions of the individual's brains. But when introducing high adrenaline, trauma, and even potential brain damage from explosions ricocheting debris into helmets, you get the reactivation of some of these traits. Not to mention that there was an even larger problem facing the clone army. The core had their reservations, and the people of the Republic weren't exactly in favor of a non-human army serving on behalf of them. Because what if these non-humans developed rebellious habits? Surely they were clones and therefore slaves, but still, what if they rose up against them? That was a plague on the Senate, and many clones, despite not being educated in the rounds that filled the Galactic Senate, saw their government turn against them. This was a hostile government, one that voted in favor of a military creation bill, but then somehow got cold feet after a victory at Geonosis. So with the clones relapsing into previous avoided issues, they also had to deal with the onset of fractures coming from within the Galactic Republic itself. This was a troublesome line of dialogue that entered clone lines immediately. A fierce sense of loyalty developed between the Darrow clones and their Jedi leaders, because the clones had seen the Jedi die for them on the fields of Geonosis, but now their true leadership, the government, was questioning if they had any sort of value at all, based solely on the system they came from. This was a morally confounding problem that ate through the morality of the clone army, and with the trauma of early battles uncovering fundamental problems in the Kaminoan experiments, there became a rise of rebellious habits. It wasn't necessarily distaste against the Republic, but those adventurous attributes that align with the explorative Darrow species had many clones questioning their value. In the Age of Empire, the human clones would have experienced this to a greater degree, because it took 3 years for their government to completely betray them. But the Darrow experienced this within weeks of the first battle, Geonosis. Sidious, and therefore Palpatine, had to regain the trust of the Senate by suggesting that these clones were valiant soldiers. The Jedi had seen it themselves, but this didn't necessarily alleviate some preconceptions many core-bred politicians had about their new military. It was a touchy subject that had some politicians starting sentences with, "I'm not a speciesist, but insert group name followed by effed up conversation," and not to mention, the delegation from Dura wasn't exactly pleased with this whole situation. While they knew that they weren't the ones sending their own people into the galaxy to fight this war, they knew that one of their people was a brave soul for giving over their genome to this grand army of the Republic. They obviously didn't know it was a callous Cad Bane, but still, it was hitting close to home for them. They, along with many other non-human delegations, started to feel the wrath of hostility. This wasn't just from the Republic either, it came from the Confederacy too. What made all of this even more bizarre was the fact that Dura was a core world located next to Corellia. It proved that if Dura wasn't, for example, a part of the core, then they would be acknowledged as lesser people, because that's what these discussions were basically saying. They were addressing the clone army not as clones, but as lesser creations because they weren't human, therefore they couldn't be treated as such, or respected as such. Though out of both major governmental systems, there was a call for a cease to such activity from the Neutral Systems Coalition, which started within the Senate itself from Senator Dan Trumrode, who spoke on behalf of the Dura people and delegation. This led to an entire bubbling of tension within the Republic, one that had Palpatine ousting Dantum and furthering the divide. The issue the Sith kept coming to was the fact that the decision to present the clone army was entirely optional. The clones didn't need to serve them, and they theoretically wouldn't be there without the Sith, yet the Senate was up in arms over their mere existence because of their species. It led to Palpatine wondering if the Senate really was worth maintaining, because with this growing divide, he might find more political strength with the Separatists, and by propelling Dooku to intergalactic prominence, as he focused on a Sith-side operation. This scenario, where Palpatine let go of the reins of the Republic, would be difficult for the power-obsessed Sith Lord, because he liked to be in control. Giving the Separatists a chance to win the war and become the dominant power in the galaxy wouldn't let him maintain his grip on the Senate, but it could allow him the chance to instruct Anakin and fully transform him into Darth Vader. So there was a positive in this potential scenario as well. While the fate of the Clone Wars sat in the hands of the leaders of both governments, the Clone Army itself was facing its own problems. Having experienced a multitude of battles, some scientifically repressed memories started to arise within the clones. This could be a number of things. The way the scientists planned on activating the contingency orders was through a low vibrational hum that could be activated with specific codes inside of all the communication devices inside the Grand Army of the Republic. The vibration would emit a variety of orders, essentially acting the same way as the inhibitor chip. But not all the clones were able to maintain repression of their memories. Trauma activated certain aspects of the brain, so some of these clones remembered, due to their photogenic memories, specific executive orders that they didn't know about prior to remembering them. This led to mutinies, wanderers, and acts against the Jedi, civilians, local governments and governors, and senators. These were called attackers across the galaxy. These wanderers, as they were called, were individuals who basically went through a total factory reset. Clone medics developed the term because they wouldn't be hostile like most mutineers. They wouldn't act on some bloodlust against a certain subgroup of the population. They would literally just start walking away. Their biological draw towards adventure had many wanderers abandoning the clone lines and vanishing into the night, or the smoke of battlefields, or wherever they could get away at. A problem that sat with many of these wanderers was their pull towards suicidal tendencies. If they were captured, that's the route they would take, because they felt like captors rather than soldiers. This variety of problems did not encompass the entire clone army. Around 19% of all clones became mutineers, wanderers, or attackers. This was a huge problem because it further divided the trust with the clones and their government. They were treated like a nuisance because they were actively breaking ranks to do obscene things, and for the other 81% of the clone army, they felt a wave of dissociation hit them. They were an outcast army, loathed by the Senate and the population that they served selflessly. Many commanders and medics had fierce loyalty because of their purpose, both in service to their brothers, but also the people they were defending. The grunts only felt this towards their brothers, which is why so much disunion came from them. The Jedi tried to maintain some semblance of harmony within these ranks, but it didn't necessarily equate to total relief, because it was equatable to turning the television off. Clones didn't see the specious rhetoric taking place within the Senate or the Confederacy with their own eyes, but they knew it was happening. They felt it on Coruscant where they were stationed, or outposts they defended across the galaxy. It was a sharp pain felt inside the command structure under Republic admirals and captains. It wasn't everyone, but it was enough to be felt across the army. The consistent, only kind people to the Duro clones were the Jedi, and that made a true difference, despite the Chancellor trying to stand up for them inside the Senate. Cad Bane, on the other hand, couldn't care less. He wasn't involved with the clones. He didn't join Dooku for the Battle of Geonosis, because he was preoccupied by an insurgency that left that Jabba wanted dealt with, which he did with the utmost skill. Cad was working with a squad of bounty hunters in his own group. Among them were Bossk, Black Chrysanthemum, and Embo. It was a deadly group, and it was very hostile, which Bane preferred. Bossk and Chrysanthemum had a love-hate relationship, and Embo was just happy to be there. They did kill clones, and this only brought Cad a sense of relief and enjoyment. He became well aware of the galactic turmoil towards his own clones, but this again did not bother him. His contract was set to expire, and he informed Tyrannus that he would continue serving with the CIS, but he wished to change the formation of his contract, because there was no need for him to return to Kamino with the Jedi now present on the planet. This was agreed upon, and Cad Bane received his final payment for the Kaminoan job. Bane's friend, Jango Fett, was living his life, working with the Pike Syndicate as a full-time member and taking jobs in Mandalore space, which included a couple hits against the Death Watch and the Mandalorian royalty. Though none of these would totally mess up Satine Kryze's Neutral Systems Coalition, which started to take a more firm approach in galactic politics. The weird thing about the distaste towards the Duro clone army was the fact that it infiltrated every aspect of government. It turned allies against each other. Firm members of the Loyalist Committee started to rationalize that their friends, cohorts, and colleagues were potentially bad for business. It sowed distrust across the ranks of the Senate. As clones fought and died on battlefields across the galaxy, wars were raged inside the glorious halls of what many thought to be the proper institution of justice. But senators, especially from the Loyalist Committee, a group that would eventually become the Delegation of 2000, started to pull away from the Republic. There was true rationale from the separatist movement, but even at that, the Confederacy had its own issues, and the result became a fourth coalition, the Tolerant Alignment. This was started through the alliance of Mina Bontiri and Padme Amidala. The two senators abandoned their own governments, believing that they had individually chosen wrong. The Tolerant Alignment, more than anything, was an extension of the Neutral Systems Coalition. The only missing factor was that these systems were not a part of the coalition itself. This was due to a number of things, but mainly, they weren't able to join because they had previous standings with the Republic and Confederacy. It was an alliance, just not a unified group. Satine believed that it could cause some internal bickering if they allowed a multitude of former CIS and Republic planets to join their coalition. It was a safe way to maintain trust, but also keep distance from potential feuding that could evolve into an extension of the current war. The Tolerant Alignment prepared safe havens for the escaping clones, and even scrounged up together resources to assist them with breaking free from the training they received on Kamino. Despite the war still commencing and the Sith forcing the clones and droids into more combative situations, there were more growing problems, ones that, thanks to Cad Bane, would result in a greater strain on the Sith plan. It all started on Kamino. The aforementioned care held by the Duro commanders kept ranks in alignment with the Grand Army Protocol, but on Kamino, one of the new martial commanders of the clone army had a defect with his memory wipes. Early into his release program, essentially the waning days before he was sent to the front lines, he experienced an adrenaline high that disrupted the cloud protecting his contingency orders. As a result, he murdered Shaak Ti in her sleep. The clones, who were very attached to the Jedi Master because of her care and love for them, therefore killed the commander. However, it did not stop there. because the clone army turned against the Kaminoans, believing that none of this would have happened if they just treated the clones with some sense of humanity. Blue blaster bolts shredded through the halls of Tipoca City, and the Kaminoans were slaughtered. It was a merciless show of force, and to cover their tracks, every Kaminoan was sunk to the bottom of the ocean, where gigantic sea monsters would eat them up, disposing of the evidence. The clones would call it a plague, and they disposed of the bodies to stop the infection from spreading. Kamino therefore became a secluded spot of rebellion. The Republic covered up all traces of this exercise by moving their fleets away, and Dooku was sent to stop it out with his own fleet, but the Jedi, believing in the autonomy of the clone army, went around the Chancellor's orders to abandon the system, as they sent their own fleet to protect it. Ironically, this was the first true show of resistance from Anakin towards the Chancellor's office. He believed in following orders, but he more so believed in defending the rights of those without a choice in the matter. He, his apprentice, and his captain of the 105th moved to Kamino to confront the Separatist fleet large enough to cripple Corelli's defenses. A space battle would erupt overhead, and General Skywalker, instead of his Delta 7 starfighter, would engage in a multitude of bombing runs against the Separatists. Thanks in part to Cad Bane, the clones were incredible pilots, and they were impossible to defeat. General Grievous, even though the assault started rough against the Kaminoan defense fleet and Skywalker's forces, led a ground invasion force per Dooku's instructions, and in this move towards Tipoca City, he'd be intercepted by Skywalker. A dogfight would commence, with Asajj Ventress attempting to aid the general instead of her Given X Fanblade starfighter. But Skywalker was able to outmaneuver the assassin and blow Grievous's starship out of the sky, sending him spiraling into the shields of a frigate nearby. Ahsoka, inside of her own Delta 7, would cut through one of Ventress's wings, and give Skywalker the chance to escape her blaze of firepower. This would inevitably result in Asajj losing her life to the Jedi. The battle wouldn't be finished with their deaths. It would be a grueling conflict that saw the actual towers of Tipoca City besieged, but even with one of the platforms sinking to the bottom of the ocean, the Jedi and clones, not the Republic, would find victory. Skywalker had his own qualms with Padme's choice to join the alignment, but even he was frustrated with Palpatine's apparent intolerance of the clone armies. The Senate was shrinking by the week, both Republic and Confederate, and their armies were still converging on battlefields. But it didn't go without notice that the clones were showing up lesser and lesser in troop numbers. It was a demoralized army, one that was much crueler than a Jango Fett army would have been, but also disheartened by the lack of support from anyone but the alignment and the Jedi. This led to the tolerant alignment growing a vast clone military by just supporting the clones, which was more than anything anyone else had ever done for them. The Sith plan was flailing out of control, and without its head operatives of Grievous and Asajj, due to its successful counter at Kamino, Tyrannus was trying to form a firm coalition inside the Confederacy, an attempt that would become a generational failure due to the lack of support within their chambers. The droids weren't fighting clones all the time. Most of them were simply acting as an occupying force, not a military designed to fight the Republic. The clones were no longer the largest concern because the original 19% mentioned before had become a staggering 67%. Most of these were mutineers, but there was a growing number of clones with traumatic responses, which activated orders that included executing the Jedi. That was the weird thing for the clones. Despite the Jedi facing the worst effects of the quote-unquote disabled clones, they still managed to care for them, because they were Jedi. Anakin had his own problems within the 105th, but they were still able to work things out without killing those clones. More or less, they turned attackers into mutineers or wanderers. By the time the first year of the war came to a conclusion, Palpatine and Dooku respectively were losing their power, ironically for different reasons. The war had gone on too long, and the Confederacy was now the very thing they swore to oppose. This didn't come from learning the truth of their military power, it came from the collapse of their alliance. The Republic was impeaching Palpatine because he stood against their more specious positions, because he was defending the clone army. His attempts to maintain the Grand Army were futile, and with both sides of conflict realizing that the war was coming to an end without the bulk of their base, they attempted to amend their relationships before the war destroyed both governments. The fall of Tyrannus and Sidious from popularity wouldn't really strike the hearts or minds of the governments. They moved to reunify as the CIS Council separated themselves from Dooku, seeing his failure as a financial investment not worth their time or credits. They had lost more than enough in this war, and the conglomerates had no intention to lose more. Now, with nothing of what he promised on the horizon, the droid armies were pulled away from every galactic battlefront. The clones still stood, despite how little of them had avoided experiences with photographic memories. They were positioned to stand at the peak of Republic influence, but there was trouble looming for those not associated with wanderers, mutineers, or attackers. Even without more than half of their army, they were still a force to be reckoned with. Their psychological defects didn't take away from the vast array of skill they possessed, and the Sith looked to exploit it, especially since the conglomerates in control over the CIS Council were no longer useful to their cause. Yes, the Sith had already dealt with the Separatist Council, in killing Wat Tambor, your new Gunray, and so on. They now planned on activating the contingency orders for the clone army, so that they could destroy the governments. Then, they would take control back over the droid armies, and use them to bring balance to the galaxy, vilify the clones, and then wipe them out. The plan would frame Dooku and Palpatine themselves as allies rather than enemies, and it would give them the chance to control the galaxy with force, considering they had lost all their control. With only 33% of the clone army still serving, they would be easy to wipe out with the droid forces, because those numbers would surely collapse by the time they activated the executive commands. But there was another unforeseen problem. Due to the end of the war, most of the still serving clones gathered up back at Kamino without Jedi interference. This was in part thanks to dozens of Jedi being killed by the clones with malfunctioning memories. Sidious and Tyrannus went to confront the clones face first as Sith. This would avoid any connection to their political bodies. Both would be cloaked in their Sith attire, robes, and hoods, covering their identities, and they would explain the situation. They were Sith, enemies of the Republic and Confederacy, here with an opportunity to provide them with freedom from their pains. Though, despite the positive start these discussions had, they didn't last. The two Sith promised an obscure vision that the clones couldn't conceptualize because of their treatment in the last year of the war. The Sith, sensing the tension, revealed the humming that would activate executive orders meant to target the Jedi Order, the Senate, and local governments around the galaxy, which included the neutral systems, tolerant alignment, and fledgling confederacy. And yes, those orders were retained, but a mistake within the vibrational hum, something the Kaminoans never found, was that the hum itself would completely dissociate the clones from reality. So anything or anyone who was not one of them, which was highly amplified by their treatment during the war, became an enemy. And well, Kamino was filled with only clones and two Sith. Blaster fire erupted over the corridors, and the halls of Kamino became a mass grave of destruction and evil. Sidious and Tyrannus operated at their fullest capacities, using electricity, force powers, and their sabers to sweep through the clone forces. The Duro clones were effective troopers, but in enclosed spaces, with monstrous force users, they were pretty much defenseless. The clones were slaughtered rampantly by the Sith, and as things started to look bad, they used detonation devices to crater in corridors, and eventually it stopped the Sith. What killed the Sith was a spat cannon from a Venator, called in for reinforcements. A singular blow that killed some clones, but also destroyed the Sith for good. The Jedi wouldn't learn about the Sith involvement in this, so they would continue to hunt for individuals responsible for the war for years, but they'd never be found. Despite the hostility of the clones stationed on Kamino, their medics, the heroes of their ranks, decided to commit to research to uncover more about their past, because so much of it was clouded by Kaminoan experiments. What the clones eventually came to learn about themselves haunted them deeply. They learned that they were only meant to be expendable. Their purpose in life wasn't meant to be living beings, but slaves for a war started 10 years before the first shot was fired. This was disheartening and world-shattering, but it didn't mean that the clones were totally helpless. They found resolve in something, an ally, one who came to Kamino following the slaughter of the Sith and the resolution of their mind fog. Senators Bon Tiri, Amidala, and Far would land on Tipoca City and reach out to the clones, offering them protection and promise them a chance to live freely in society. The representative of Duro wished to give them the chance to be regarded as citizens and offer programs to integrate them back into society. The 3 senators present had agreed that Onderon, Naboo, and Rhodia were to be safe havens for the clones. Now learning of Kamino's freedom, they would also offer Duro, Bora Vio, and Kamino as alternative homes for these clones, which permitted them a chance to spread out relatively evenly to these 6 locations, which didn't put a lot of pressure on the citizen populations or local budgets. The tolerant alignment soon became very involved with the neutral systems, especially because the droid armies were left without leadership and were mostly just waiting for command. The Republican Confederacy had destroyed themselves politically, and there was very little they could do to resurrect their structure of their governance. Instead, they would become overshadowed in the following years by the alignment. This was the combination name agreed on by the Tolerant and Neutral Systems Coalition. It was quadruple the size of the combined Republican Confederacy at the time, and thanks in part to Corellia, Raxus, Mandalore, Alderaan, and Chandrilla having a piece of influence inside the pie, systems rallied around its power. This did start trade wars with the ever-so-hostile Coruscant, but the Jedi who supported the people over the failed government were able to lift those hostilities and assist in the continuation of diplomacy. They also, as a result of the war and ensuing tension between the fractured alliance and the alignment, removed themselves from Coruscant altogether. The irony of the situation is the alignment was a collaboration between former separatists, Republic senators, and the neutral systems representatives. The fractured alliance was basically the same, except no one from the coalition ever joined them, so it was the former warring factions that joined together to fight the alignment. Thanks to the boost in population on 4 of the populated worlds offered to the clones, they were able to grow their economies, not a ton, but enough. The clones fit into the societies and were welcomed with open arms. This permitted them the chance to understand themselves and the sick predicament they were born into. While Cad Bane would never have a part in their lives again, he did profit off of their pain. His insane squad now included Jango Fett, who after years of considering settling down, decided to join the group of bounty hunters. They were an elite unit, the most feared bounty hunters in the galaxy. The Jedi would hunt them for decades, but never come close to ever capturing them, let alone stopping them. Eventually, the alignment would become the main power in the galaxy. Resistance remained on Coruscant, but the alignment instead found home on a now flourishing new Ecumenopolis at Hosnian Prime. Many surviving clones would also find home in the new capital of the galaxy, as the tensions from a forced conflict slowly dissipated in the years that followed. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Let's talk about this story. Little bit weird. It is a little bit weird. I do acknowledge that. This is a weird story. This one plays with a lot of odd themes, and I'm not gonna lie, it's probably because I'm watching Andor and reading a book about King Henry V at the same time, and that's probably where it's coming from, because this is just bizarre. I really wanted to play with the idea of the core responding differently to the clone army being Duro. I believed that that was an appropriate way to handle this. I think that's something that the Galactic Core would respond to, is that the clone army with Jango Fett clones seemed more in their control, whereas a Duro might not. It might elicit more hostility from the public, or outrage, and that's what I wanted to depict here. I also wanted to show that the clones themselves would have differing side effects, and I think the clones in this clone army would have a lot of tough incidents. The photogenic memory I thought would be a really good use. It's part of, I think, Legends lore, that the Duro have photogenic memories, and I wanted to play into that for the clones and not being able to use inhibitor chips, and so trying to use alternative methods, ones that end up failing completely. A lot of the story is really pretty grim, and I wanted to capture, honestly, how grim the clone army really is. It's one big experiment, and I feel like this gives a lot more depth to the emotionality of what these clones probably would go through, both in the societal level in this universe, but also on the personal level, especially because a lot of the Kaminoan experiments on the Duros don't exactly succeed. They more or less fail upwards into a place where they're kind of successful enough to go forward with it. So I hope you all enjoyed this kind of grim story. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.